Is he reconnecting or has he just dropped out entirely?
He said he's reconnecting, but yeah, I can start like whenever you guys want. You guys just want to wait like 30 seconds for him or something, or I can just.
I'll give him one last chance, this 30 seconds. But yeah, if this one isn't working, we're just going to have to get you to speak PM.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hello. Is this functional?
Yeah, that sounds better. Hopefully this one works.
All right. Oh God, so horrible. Okay, I'll just say one sentence quickly. This thus regrets the belief that forgiveness is a virtue.
Yeah, that was fine.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, start when you're ready.
Yeah. Time. 3, 2, 1. On opening government, we think that forgiveness is an extremely important experience for individuals going through an experience of grief and suffering. We think that the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue has made it seem as though forgiving someone automatically makes you a bigger person. It makes you an evolved individual. The fact that you chose to let go over choosing to try to process the emotion or try to process the anger is one which makes you socially and personally reputed. It enforces your personal worth and value. That is how these beliefs work and act as a coercing force to always preference forgiveness over other processes once you've suffered. We think this is primarily enforced strongly because these beliefs are often enforced through the state, through your communities, through schools, and through your family, which means to a large extent, this is something everyone has accepted. The comparison we believe is that forgiveness is something that ought to be to the individualized, to each individual person. Whether they want to do it at a particular point in time, how they feel after doing it is up to them. Given that is the comparative in this debate, two things in this speech. First, I'll explain why applying forgiveness to everyone blanketly is bad. Second, I'll explain why this is taking away agency from victims. Firstly, on why it's bad to apply this to everybody. Because currently this narrative applies to everyone in sort of a one-size-fits-all manner. This is bad because grief and suffering is often not experienced or processed uniformly. It is often the case that the extent to which you suffer or the extent to which you need time to process grief depends on things like your conditioning, on the place which you were born into, on the values that your family specifically gave to you. Or it depends on the way in which your personal life actually affects you. For example, if you're an individual that is arbitrarily born into an area that is significantly higher portion of crime, perhaps you are someone who is just more attuned or like experience a significantly higher degree of grief from the different forces of crime within society. But the expectation across the board remains that you ought to forgive at the same scale, even if you're repeatedly being hurt by arbitrary circumstances and you're not in a position where you are yet ready to move on from those things. The problem with this is that despite the different types of suffering and the different requirements of processing that is therefore needed, individuals are forced to forgive without truly processing these emotions and truly processing the anger. This is bad for two reasons. Firstly, it is incredibly coercive to a person who is at a very low point in their life where they're already going through a painful experience, suffering those, like whatever crime it might be that they're going through, whatever injustice they might be experiencing. At that point, this belief kicks in and tells you that this is wrong. You ought to do something else and move on. So this is incredibly coercive at a point when these individuals are particularly vulnerable. But the second harm is that it often leaves no time for people to actually process that grief, which means while society tells you to move on, you go out of your way to try to forgive and get past it. The problem with this is that it often means you don't fully understand the extent to which this actually did impact you. You don't understand how it may have affected your life to the greatest extent. To that extent, then, we think it is often the case that people cannot fully process the emotion and what they actually felt at that point. And these might be things which remain as lingering emotions in their mind, where one experience of harassment does always interact or influence your relationship with that same type of individual in the future, but you can never point it back to that one source, because what you are told is you ought to forgive other than essentially processing that information. On the comparative on our side, even if you are angry at the point where you would otherwise would have forgiven these individuals, there are three things that might be possible. if it was the case that the reason for you suffering was an extremely coercive and toxic element or some really terrible person, it is good if you're angry and essentially remove that person from your life in many instances. If that's not the suggestion we go with, we think that when you try to assess the situation, you are not overtly skeptical of your own self, but rather you are likely to assess the position from like actually looking at the perpetrator as someone who is quite wrong and you are angry at them, and that's the point from which you make that assessment. This might make it more difficult for you to forgive some people, but at least you are not doing one which empowers the perpetrator over yourself. But lastly, it is often the case that when you are visibly aggrieved and you're able to express those emotions, you are likely to get more support from your family and friends. At that point where you have accepted that you're angry, you're more likely to seek help than in one where you already believe that you've moved on, which means all of the processes by which people like kind of process trauma and process suffering is significantly better in a world where this virtue does not exist. Before I move on to the second point about agency, closing opposition.
This seems to be an argument for a narrative that says people ought to forgive them immediately, but not an argument for why you should not forgive at all.
Look, I think the fact that it is considered a virtue means that there is an overwhelming pressure for you to always forgive. This is not to say in one world people will forgive, in another world people will not, but the pressure to forgive is significantly higher with this virtue. That is why all of these impacts still apply on the scale. Okay, secondly, with respect to victims, I would say that it is often the case that this narrative takes away agency from the victim by policing their emotions and essentially supporting individuals who have already wronged. This is done in three ways. Firstly, when you are trying to blame someone for something wrong they did and you want to hold on to your anger because you have felt an extreme degree of pain at a point where you have been like kind of hurt, at that point people tell you that it is perhaps not that bad, which means for feeling angry about having been through trauma, you are made to feel guilty. That is one. Secondly, it is often the case that this often makes you question the wrongdoing itself, because the point at which people keep telling you that it is perhaps not really a realistic expression of your anger when you keep doing this, you would rather forgive and move on, because that is how everyone will have a more harmonious life. They paint the picture in such a way because it is virtuous that it makes you feel like you are overreacting. Maybe you are someone who ought to be blamed for overreacting at that point. We think this is extremely terrible because once you've already suffered through the trauma of whatever experience you're going through, you experience a double jeopardy where you have to constantly question yourself and defend that other person at a certain point in time. The last thing is, in a lot of instances where there is no absolute black or white in terms of the types of guilt that individual is facing, where there's a gray area, where there may be a wrongdoing or something that might be morally questionable, the victim is always going to be given less of the benefit of doubt because they are more prone to going into forgiveness. The problem with all of this is, whilst in the immediacy you have double jeopardy for the most vulnerable actors in this debate, once you are able to overcome this anger at a point in time where you forgive someone, you can never go back to that issue and reconcile those problems because it would only be petty to go back to those positions. The last thing I want to note in framing, though, is that this is uniquely harmful to the poor and vulnerable because those are individuals who prioritize things like virtues the most because other things like material goods are often taken away from them due to arbitrary disprivilege or forces of injustice, which means it is most easy to enforce this rule onto them, and that means that the vast majority of individuals can get away without considering the harm they do to them, provide them with less reparations and get away with it, and these people would likely accept it in a world this virtue exists. We want to remove all of this and show you the value of forgiveness in a world that does not have this virtue. Glad to propose.
I have the Prime Minister and welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Awesome. 3, 2, 1, go. Like every good first speaker, I'm going to start my speech with a weighing. So let's look at what is the actual trade-off in this debate. I think it is obvious to everyone that there are instances in which it is good to forgive and instances in which it is bad. Just to throw off the bat really quickly, all of the good impacts of forgiveness that opening government didn't preemptively engage with, and I hope that they will engage at some point on government bench. So obviously forgiveness is good, A, for just the ability to do things such as peacekeeping, right? Whether it is in the large scale, such as being able to forgive your enemy and actually get to a peace agreement, or in the small scale of actually getting across a fight with a friend, a partner, etc., and actually making your relationship be better again. Secondly, obviously, forgiveness is better for rehabilitation for people, right? In terms of us being able to get over our revengeful feeling and wanting to be tough on crime and actually be willing to forgive someone, give them a second chance to reintegrate into society, etc. Forgiveness is a great virtue in this case to actually give people the feeling that they can have a second chance, that they don't necessarily have to continue with their atrocious ways because they can be forgiven and they know this, which is a good incentive for people to actually improve as human beings. But thirdly, Thirdly, because obviously, just in many cases, people deserve forgiveness because in many cases, they just made a mistake because all humans make mistakes and we think that it is just a right thing to do. Now, obviously, there are some bad examples of when forgiveness might happen, like what OG kind of analyzed but never give an example for. So let's actually be beneficial for them and say maybe the instance in which I'm too much forgiving my abuser and therefore not actually noticing that someone is harmful to me, or maybe an instance in which I don't try to fix the system or whatever because I think that I need to forgive. Let's say that they did analyze that, though they didn't. What is then important in order to actually win the debate? This whole debate plays down on characterization. Since if there are good and bad instances, the only question then remaining is, when is this narrative actually impactful? Do people use it for good or for worse? Does it make them forgive in the good instances or in the bad ones? For this reason, 3 points in my speech to engage directly with that. Firstly, characterizing how forgiveness looks today and what you expect to get in return for your forgiveness and why the entire of the logical foundation for OG doesn't stand. Secondly, for characterizing the counterfactual, that is where in the counterfactual people are likely to not forgive enough and why we create a balance. And lastly, characterizing the actors susceptible to the narrative, why particularly the people who are likely to accept the narrative of forgiveness are the ones in positions of power, whereas the people who are victims that OG talks about would be forgiving without the narrative anyway, and therefore would be an asymmetry of power, which we are fixing. The rebuttal will be integrated. Please note, OG didn't provide us any characterization, neither of how this narrative looks like, nor how the counterfactual would look like, neither did they take my POI of clarification, so I'm happy to characterize it for you. Let's start with how does forgiveness actually look like? And I want to flag here, note, integrated rebuttal, the entirety, please note, look at your notes. The entirety of OG's case is reliant on the premise that forgiveness, on the narrative of forgiveness as a virtue, means that you always need to accept. They are completely reliant on a very extreme characterization of people should always accept it, let it go, and never actually acknowledge something was wrong to them. 4 reasons why it is not likely. Firstly, because logically speaking, we think that just people are reasonable human beings, right? Maybe some of them are not perfect or in terms of nuance, but we think that human beings do actually acknowledge the thing of, we do need to expect that something wrong was done here. People have this innate feeling that something wrong was done to them. They are still upset. They need to feel some sort of catharsis of something being fixed for this. Secondly, just in terms of a reality check, please note, this motion regrets something that exists in the status quo. We all know how this narrative looks in the status quo. We tell kids, be the bigger person and forgive, but we first tell them, say sorry, right? You only do the forgiveness after the apology has taken place. We see this also in the legal system. People say you need to forgive people for maybe crimes they did in the past after they have already expressed a sincere apology. Thirdly, because not just the wording of the motion, virtue, forgiveness is a virtue, not an obligation. This is something nice to do. It makes you a good person if you do that. This is not something that you have to do all the time or you're expected to do all the time. And lastly, because forgiveness is not equivalent to letting go, right? You can forgive someone, but still acknowledge that something wrong was done to you. That is the end of OG at this. But why do we think that we create a balance? Because note 4 reasons why on the counterfactual, we think people would nearly never forgive. Firstly, because of the counter narratives, because there's more than just one narrative in society. And we think that there are so many narratives in the direction of justice. Our stories from children from the very first age about good versus evil, of revenge, of trying to get people may pay amends for what they did. In religion, we see it all the time, in the gods punishing for sins, etc. People have a counter narrative against forgiveness. Secondly, just their innate anger. It is hard to forgive after I was wronged. I want to get amends for it, right? Thirdly, just the fact that it is hard for people to imagine the other side's perspective. When something wrong was done to me, I can very easily imagine, or not even imagine, know how I feel, but I don't know the other side's perspective. I can't walk in their shoes. I don't know how they are feeling. I can try, but it requires an extra step, whereas feeling the anger doesn't require the extra step. It is much easier. Fourthly, because it just has so much to do with ego, right? Because we have so many narratives in society about respect being connected to actually you needing to not forgive someone, to actually needing to pay your respect for your name, for your family, for whatever. Meaning that the counterfactual would be not forgiving enough. What we do on our side, as I've characterized that we do make people not always forgive, is we just tone down this emotional thing. We tone down the emotional reaction and let them think rationally. Think, yes, I was wronged. Maybe this person still deserves to go to jail for deterrence purposes or whatever, but I don't need to actively revenge them, right? We take away the emotional process of it and let you actually think rationally of the result, actually enabling for a good balance of when to do this. I'd like to take closing extension if they have one. Closing does not wish to engage. OG? Everyone agrees so far. Great. Let's move on to the second point then. Who actually is susceptible to this narrative? So why do we think the vulnerable people, the victims OG talks about, would be forgiving at the counterfactual anyway? Firstly, because we think that they are just used to too late. Because like time. They are just too used to accepting shit from society. They don't even feel like they've been done anything wrong. Just think of the situation of women who are victims of abuse. It's not the situation that they forgive their assaulter. They usually don't even think that they were assaulted. They don't acknowledge something wrong was done because they're so used to it. They are taught from society that it is all right. It's not about forgiveness. They will just accept shit regardless because unfortunately this is the way society works. Secondly, because they don't have the chance to actually internalize the feeling of wanting to revenge. Because people in positions of power throughout their life had the opportunity to revenge, had the opportunity to punish anyone who did something wrong to them. People in positions of weakness never had this opportunity, so they don't internalize this as a coping mechanism. They are not used to cope with their problems by revenge. And thirdly, because for minorities, it's not an issue of virtue, right? If we take OG's logic, because minorities fight every day for their daily struggles, in the pyramid of Maslow's needs, they don't actually get to the point of caring about virtue. They need to survive. It is the rich and the privileged that have the opportunity to actually care about virtue, their perception, their virtue signaling, looking good. This is why all rich people try to be philanthropists now, right? Meaning that we fix what would be in the counterfactual and asymmetry of forgiveness. Beg you to oppose.
I thank Leader of Opposition and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Right. Right, I'll just get on my stopwatch. Right. Starting in three, 2, 1. I think that speech was incredibly ignorant of structural reasons as to why people, even if they are willing to forgive, they never have the time to process for the willingness to forgive. Because I think a lot of these things that they talk about were merely asserted as to what people are reasonable. People will only forgive for being finding an apology. Also, that this is a virtue but not an obligation. But Wasif clearly gave you reasons as to why the moment you glorify this as a virtue, it doesn't necessarily then become a choice or an option, but rather something that becomes coercive in the long run. And I think DLO at that point of time needs to basically talk about the coercive metrics of this particular like glorification of this virtue. Because if they don't, I think they're assuming that people will still be rational headed in the very first place. And if that is the case, that if people are willingly reasonable, that people will only forgive for being after getting an apology, I don't really think that you need this to be then characterized as a virtue, but rather let this be characterized as something as normal as other things inherently. I think it still can exist, but it doesn't really have to be the glorification of this particular virtue in the form of virtue in the very first place. So that's something that essentially need to talk about. All right. So I'll deal with their case in a few parts. The first part being that you are not always willing to you're not always going to forgive just because of that, but the virtue inherently is important. I think the first thing you need to talk about is that the coercive metrics that exist as a result of this. So what happens when this is then talked about as a virtue to the best possible extent? I think first of all, when individuals are committed, when there is a crime or when there is some sort of offense committed against one particular individual, their social standing always takes a like a degradation. What do I mean by that? So for example, if you are someone against who a crime has been committed, you basically get pushed down the social ladder, or you feel like you get pushed down the social ladder. Or for example, if you're someone who's been bullied by your bully and it says tell you something insulting, you feel like your status has been degraded. I think at that point of time, what the only thing that's on your mind is, how do I earn back my dignity? or how do I get back the respect that I lost as a result of this action? More often than not, the only way that people feel that they can get back their dignity or get back their respect is by being the more evolved person or by being the bigger man, as they say. The only way then that this is possible at that point of time is A, either be vindictive or be very petty and outrage against that individual, or just ensure that at that point of time, the easier thing to do is then just to forgive that person and show everyone else that even if they were petty, I was the person who's a bigger man. I think it is at that point of time you need to understand the mentality of the individuals against who the offense was committed and the pressure that they feel to forgive to the last possible extent. So yes, even if they're reasonable, even if this comes after forgiveness to a large extent, you cannot call it an informed choice by any point in time, because there's a huge power disparity when they're making that particular choice. What is the counterfactual? The counterfactual is in a situation where this wasn't really a virtue, and where they felt that, okay, this does not automatically make me the bigger man, means that that's a situation where they process what they went through, where they process what happened to them, and whether someone really deserves the forgiveness in the very first place. That's first. The second thing that you need to understand, and that once again directly clashes with opening opposition, is then do you really process from what happens to you, what other people do to you in the very first place? I think number one, when there is no glorification of this virtue, or when it is not a virtue, to a large extent, individuals, but naturally, even if they're reasonable, even if they're not reasonable, don't want to hold on to baggage to a large extent. That's first. But secondly, one of the biggest parts about a crime being committed against you is some level of self-shaming that happens, which is to say, for example, if someone calls you fat, you actually examine that whether you're fat or not. Or for example, the victim blaming that happens in society, especially in developing countries, when you get teased, or for example, when you get sexually harassed. So self-reflection is an automatic process when something has been done against you. And the process of self-reflection often involves, to a large extent, examining why the other person did what they did in the very first place. The difference over here is, I think I disagree with OO when they say that there is basically no self-reflection and there is no like introspection into why a particular crime was committed in the very first place. I think that introspection happens either way. I think the way that the difference that works is the pressure that is on you to justify that introspection in the very first place, which is to say, do you then at that point of time introspect and then try and have a mentality that I need to know, or I need to look for a reason to justify the forgiveness or justify why they're being forgiven? Or under our world, when this is not a virtue, you look at the core aspect as to why they did what they did, and do they deserve the forgiveness or not in the very first place. The worst part about this is that this is absolutely irreversible and something that they're very, very willing to ignore throughout Wasi's speech. I'll go on to this, but before that, I'll take closing opposition.
So I think this argument only works if that absent this narrative, there are no counter forces that make you not do forgiveness or do things like become angry or do things like deny. In a world where these things exist, which you have not engaged with, how then do you make sure that people are quote unquote rational under your side?
I think first of all, it's just easy to prove that a lot of people will be rational, because one, I think there is, first of all, revenge in and of itself, or cold-blooded revenge in and of itself is not a virtue that is glorified in the very first place. So I think the onus is then on you guys to tell me that in absence of this being a virtue, other like narratives become that much more empowered in the very first place. That's first. But secondly, I think revenge in and of itself is one that's quite under-glorified as well, and I don't think that is something that happens as a result of virtue being glorified, or forgiveness being a virtue as well. So, for example, things like harming someone else, or things like eye for an eye, or things like, say, for example, rehabilitative justice are like the norms within the society. It doesn't have to be like, just because victims forgive you doesn't mean you go to rehabilitation. You go to rehabilitation because the law states that you have to do in this sort of situations. So I don't really think that you guys can just counter assert that, oh, if this is not the narrative, this automatically becomes the opposite narrative, because there are a lot of things that don't depend on forgiveness but yet are the moderation. So I think what you need to understand is that to a large extent that this virtue to a large extent is sort of like irreversible, which is to say, in a moment of heat, if you make the wrong decision of forgiving someone, or if you feel like you're not over it, the moment you raise your voice about this particular thing back into mainstream society, you are basically tagged as someone who's just incredibly petty because you chose to forgive this individual. Why are you coming back with this particular issue? What that basically means is it's basically a one-size-fits-all policy for all victims of trauma or for all victims of some sort of shaming who can't in the past, who can't in the future go back and talk about these things that happened to them because it's just incredibly bad for them to do so. Thank you.
And Deputy Prime Minister, welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
3, 2, 1. Note that I'm going to take exactly as many POIs from opening government as they took from us. Please CG have a POI at like 5:45. Look, let's be very clear here. Opening government tells you two lies. First of all, they claim that Hadal is assertive, and you can call her many things, but assertive is not one of them, because Hadal actually gives you a lot of mechanisms, specifically on the one burden that DPM places on us, and that is we need to talk about the coercive nature of, you know, the virtue of forgiveness. Hadal does that at length for the majority of her speech when she explains to you in 4 separate mechanisms. First of all, why it is uniquely something that impacts disproportionately those in positions of power as opposed to those that opening government cares about, specifically under the metric that virtues are generally something that are, you know, placed upon people in positions of power to a far larger extent than those who are not, because generally when you're struggling for survival, your primary need isn't to, you know, fulfill some arbitrary virtue, but is to fulfill survival, meaning that just in terms of accessibility, this is disproportionately not impacting the people opening government cares about the most. Note that they don't actually respond to Hadal in any meaningful way whatsoever on that. The second thing that Hadal tells you on this, though, is specifically that, you know, when you're expected to actually forgive, that also creates an impetus for people to ask for forgiveness and to ask for forgiveness in a way that is reciprocal to the nature of what you have done, meaning that reparations, generally speaking, are also then reflective of the kind of thing that you have done. There are a few examples I can give of this, but like big noteworthy ones are like, you know, Nazi Germany paying reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, the Australian government finally, after way too long, but eventually asking for forgiveness for the stolen generation and all that stuff, right? We think these kinds of things happen far more in the world where forgiveness is a virtue and, you know, people aren't just inherently monsters and framed as monsters forever and ever, because note that the virtue of forgiveness is something that it works both ways. You being expected to forgive also creates an impetus to ask for forgiveness, and this is specifically where opening government doesn't actually engage with in any way whatsoever. This is where I'm going to add more onto the stuff we already get from Hadal. Note that opening government is not being comparative at all with this. Don't actually respond to Hadal on this at all. Let's deal then, let's go straight into it then, because what does the norm of asking for forgiveness create? First of all, it is something that is good for minorities. Why? Specifically because they tend to disproportionately be the ones on the receiving end of, you know, injustice. We think when there is a general impetus to not sweep the things you have done under the rug, and generally there is a mechanism for you to ask for forgiveness, people are far more likely to want to do that. Because when you can actually garner forgiveness, there is a way out. When you are backed into a corner and you have a choice between I'm a moral monster and I forevermore will be, or I should and can ask for forgiveness and also in return for expect it, the likelihood, note nothing in this debate on either side is absolute, so we mostly care about where are the odds bigger. The odds are bigger on our side of the house that people will actually go specifically for that. We think this is particularly important for exactly the people opening government cares about, specifically because we think that they benefit the most from people asking for forgiveness. Again, I'm not going to take you. The second thing then is the second thing is self-forgiveness, because I agree with opening government. There is this introspection, there is this self-inflection, but do you know where I think this happens far more than when someone hurts you? When you are actually already someone who is very harsh on themselves in general. When you're someone who is so introspective that you are far more likely to actually be able to forgive yourself than if you exist in a culture that doesn't generally think forgiveness is a virtue. Why? Because you're more likely to think that people generally are deserving of forgiveness than if not. Meaning that if you have done something that no one generally thinks is wrong, but you personally think might be wrong, then you're more likely to forgive that on our side. We think this is important for several reasons, but notably just in terms of dealing with depression, that is very well established in, you know, psychiatric literature, etc., that people who are willing to forgive forgive and able to forgive are generally speaking less likely to be depressed, specifically because they have that belief that people aren't irrevocably broken. We think this is then, under our comparative, in a world where people generally believe this more, just a net good impact on this. Thirdly, this whole idea of, you know, when I know I can be forgiven, you don't keep going down that path. First of all, you're more likely to accept and acknowledge when something is wrong. Why? Because you're more able to have a way out. You're less likely to even do the initial acceptance of acknowledging something being wrong if you don't accept also that there's a way out. You're more likely to double down when you know there's no way out. Notable examples of this are, you know, when people in evil regimes try to bury the evidence, specifically because they know they have gone beyond the step of where any reasonable person would forgive them. We say that this impetus becomes greater the less the balance lies on the side of people being willing to forgive you, and the more people are going to push to gaslighting victims, to gaslight their experience, to make them feel like what happened to them wasn't so bad, because there is no way out. And we think on the comparative then, in terms of actual damages being done to people that opening government cares about, we take that as well. Closing, I really want to engage. Fine,
okay.
open.
Okay, the one thing that your case depends upon is the premise that people are more likely to ask for forgiveness. Why, if you believe that forgiveness is a virtue and that it's a characteristic of a good human being, are you not more likely to believe that you deserve forgiveness in the first place, so do less to actually achieve it and make up for things?
Because if you think it is a virtue, that means by definition you think it is something that is good and something that is desirable, meaning that under the analysis we already get from Hadal, it's just something where people want to be virtuous, specifically in positions of power, because generally speaking, being a virtuous individual is also then linked to your status and to your position. Note, for instance, that chivalrous knights weren't somehow inherently good individuals. They acted under their code, not because it was something, because being virtuous was something that was inherently good to them. It was something that protected and entrenched their status, and that is something they cared about. Note that we think that having generally positive virtues and seeing these things as generally virtuous then also makes people more likely to want to act on it, more likely to want to receive it, and more likely to see it as something worthy of pursuit if it is something that is seen as positive. We think that the mere virtue of forgiveness is linked to asking for forgiveness, specifically because you can expect that you will receive this. We think that then in return, it is more likely that you will actually be open to admitting fault and also be more open to actually acknowledging that this is something wrong has been done, when you can expect to not be excluded from society for all time to follow. We think therefore on the comparative, we are far better, whatever. I stand in opposition.
And the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and welcome the Member of Government.
Do people hear me?
Yep.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Before I move on to explaining why this narrative insulates people from actually seeking support, which is the primary thing you need to have when dealing with trauma, a lot of framing to take out opening opposition. First of all, what they do not realize is that on an individual level, people are still likely to forgive or at least move on from traumatic experiences after some time anyway, for at least 4 reasons. One, people very often tend to want to mend and repair relationships they have been emotionally invested into, have created memories with, and simply have emotions of love or affection for certain people. You have an incentive to make it up to them because you have this connection and because you also gain some kind of emotional positive feedback from it at the point when the relationship is healthy. But secondly, anger as an emotion is strenuous. It drains you because it's something that consumes you. You feel it all the time. You feel you cannot deal with it. You can never have enough revenge. You can never actually express this anger in such a way to make up for the things that have been done to you. But thirdly, if this turns into an obsession, you think so much about a person that has wronged you. You think about all the things you want done to them, all the harm you want to come upon them, but you cannot bring this harm. And then even if something bad does happen to them, you find that it's not fulfilling because it does not take away the pain you have felt. It maybe gives you momentary satisfaction. But after several such events, you realize that the emotional pain that you feel has not been removed from you. And therefore, naturally, you seek other mechanisms of coping because you seek to eliminate the feeling of like the void and the emptiness that's being created in you. But fourthly, even without the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue, you probably still feel kind of better when you forgive, because you can still say, I was the bigger man. I moved on from this. I was able to say, I have the ability to get past this experience. We don't think that's something to do with being a virtue, that in general, people can use this to rationalize to themselves why they have forgiven. And these are quite strong incentives and momentary and emotional incentives. So the point where opening opposition does not explain why the narratives and the stories read to you as a child are going to overpower the incentives I gave you at the point of actual emotional strain. It's probably likely to be stronger framing. The comparative is therefore, we probably get forgiveness on both sides of the house, but it's worse on theirs. But then they bring a different case. They say this is also about asking for forgiveness, and it impacts groups like minorities. No, they misinterpret the motion. Forgiveness is a virtue for the dispenser of forgiveness. I am virtuous because I have forgiven. This does not mean, nor is it a corollary. It would have been nice if all explained why. Asking for forgiveness is also something that is considered virtuous. Those are not two of the same things. Therefore, when they talk about things like minorities, they completely miss the mechanism. So if there are individuals who deeply care about the plight of minorities, this is probably because things like empathy exists, because you have an innate feeling of justice, because you have probably also felt discrimination in your life and can put yourself in like the shoes of these people and you feel you've done something wrong. I think people still forgive in a world where forgiveness is not considered a virtue, because people can still feel empathy. On the other side, if somebody is a fucking blatant racist, I don't think that saying maybe that you should ask for forgiveness is something that's going to make him ask for forgiveness, because he doesn't think he's done something wrong in the first place, because he thinks that actually asking for forgiveness would be immoral, because he would be going against what is currently his system of beliefs. So there are different mechanisms at play, and opening opposition does not explain why their mechanism is key. Same applies for the Australian government apologizing, whatever. That's a fucking diplomatic move. You don't do that because your parents taught you that you should say sorry. You do that because if you don't do that, you get less diplomatic support, because you're like burned in like the international community, because people tell you committed genocide and ethnic cleansing and you don't even want to admit it, and it generally tends to be bad for reputation. It's completely unclear for opening opposition why this is the mechanism for their case. But and also, even if they are right, I would say that like their narrative creates more complacency, because if forgiveness is a virtue, it is the mark of a good person. This therefore means that you tend to believe that if someone is a good person, if they are truly understanding, they will forgive you. You may realize that you've done something wrong, but you will not think that's a reason to rethink yourself, to introspect, or to try to make it up, because you expect of the other person to accept this as a human flaw, not necessarily something that you have to improve on. This in conjunction with the natural human mechanism of wanting to rationalize our mistakes, because we want to maintain an image of moral integrity, saying we might have made a mistake, but it says nothing about our character. The idea that forgiveness is a virtue helps us push the responsibility and the blame on the other person. And lastly, we see no reason from opening opposition why I shouldn't be angry if crime has been committed, and why I shouldn't want to be tough on crime if I have gone through a traumatic experience. Very often it's cathartic to be pissed. It's cathartic to say, look, I want this person to die. I want this person to suffer. I want them to feel pain, and I'm happy to see them taken away to jail in handcuffs. This may be part of my experience of recovery. If the opening opposition has no epistemic access to the full repository of emotions that people feel in specific situations, we see there is absolutely no right from society to take away that agency. Before I move on to support and stuff, I'll take over.
Your competing analysis proves that in the long term, people might let it go. But when you react immediately, break up, fight back, put someone in jail, it is hard to revoke this. There's irreversible damage that might even lead to more hurting, thus more anger, thus repeating the lack of forgiveness.
Your best case scenario is a 50-50 chance. Given neither you or I have the access to what's going to happen, and probably the individual person has the largest access to their emotions, the safest bet is probably to let them react in a way they would want to. But on the support, look at the way this narrative works. You are taught by your family that you maybe should not bring this issue up to your husband because you need to have peace in the house. You're going to make like the house worse for the children, like lead to a divorce if you speak out. Your friends tell you, you might be too bitter, but even tell you what you should do for yourself. It's bad for you to be so angry, like let it go. Religion tells you turn the other cheek. This means that you have less opportunity to communicate with others. Why is this important? Because the first step of any kind of recovery is for someone to validate your grief, to validate your emotions, for someone to confirm that what you are feeling is an issue in and of itself. Because otherwise, especially in emotional relationships, you are likely to doubt yourself and to doubt whether or not what you're thinking of has ever been an issue and something that you're supposed to deal with. On your side of the house, people feel that they cannot speak at all because they're going to be blamed for speaking out, and they're not going to be able to get their emotions across, which in and of itself is a frustrating experience because I feel something and words cannot describe or cannot transmit the message of how I am feeling. So to avoid this frustrating experience, you like to insulate yourself from speaking to other people. Even if you would get support, you fear that you wouldn't. Therefore, you are isolated from advice, but also you are left alone, which means that you are more prone to self-doubt. You are more prone to the idea that what you are feeling is not even a valid emotion. This is a problem because then problems in relationships are left unsolved and your emotions suffer even further. Whatever the resolution to your problem is, you always feel the need to maintain integrity. To maintain integrity and feeling that you're a good person, somebody needs to tell you you're not guilty for feeling the way you feel. When you insulate yourself from people who can tell you that, you're less likely to seek conflict resolution. It's especially important for abusive relationships where things like gaslighting happens and like you essentially skew the power dynamics against the person who has been wrong for all these reasons. Closing government.
Take the member of government. Welcome the member of opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. All right. We're going to start in 3, 2, 1. So we're going to take the worst case and say that even if forgiveness is a coercive influence that allows individuals to forgive even if they might not have otherwise, I would say it is necessary in the face of the animalistic nature of anger that is forced upon individuals, and moreover, is incredibly necessary in periods of conflict and intense kinds of hatred. I'm going to talk mainly about 3 things. Firstly, responding to the previous speaker on victims and healing. Second, I'll make 2 broad principled claims as to why forgiveness in itself is a moral thing that must be done at many points in time. Lastly, I would say that it's good for minorities and being able to create better social cohesion. Firstly, on victims and of healing. So a lot of the Gov case relies on forgiveness always being immediate on our side and on their side being chosen in an incredibly rational manner. But take note, I think 1, a lot of the initial MG reframing relies on forgiveness still being a virtue. You're only the bigger person if this is something that is seen to be a morally good action, and therefore they can't claim that they're still going to do it for that kind of thing. But secondly, you only want to do these kinds of things if you grow up conditioned and socialized thinking that this is a valid reaction to a lot of the initial anger that you might feel. I think 1, he contradicts this when he says anger is very cathartic. You want to see someone suffer. You want to see someone go to jail. And therefore, it's unlikely you can just reasonably be able to forgive all these people that he wants to be able to forgive. Number 2, it's an animalistic emotion born out of our evolutionary need to be able to survive because you have to fight. You have to be able to fend for yourself, and that thing only anger can do. And I think this rebuts the MG material with regard to you get more expression on their side, because it is precisely the irrational emotion of anger that makes any sort of expression that you have seem irrational, unreasonable, in ways that always frame especially minority groups, especially victims, to be seen as maybe thuggish, maybe crazy, maybe whatever other like dangerous word or term you want to be able to describe to them, and discredits whatever degree of action they're going to take, rather than being able to ensure that they can be seen as the more moral individuals and therefore should be listened to and should be heard. But secondly, I would make the claim that especially for victims who are weak, who are powerless, it's very unlikely that calling out for justice works for you, precisely because systems of justice are tilted against minority groups, are tilted against victims of harassment. And I would make the claim that in the instance that both sides are unable to provide this, it is uniquely forgiveness that allows individuals to take power over the actions that they have, be able to reframe formerly traumatic actions as ones that put them on the moral pedestal, and therefore be able to change in their mind how they process what traumatic actions in the past might have happened. In the instance that they cannot promise us some degree of tangible action, we need to ensure that the ability for you to process previous action is good for minority groups. No thanks. Secondly, on social conflict and being able to create greater social cohesion. Firstly, on conflict, especially in maybe ethnic tension, multicultural societies, etc. The ability to pursue forgiveness is necessary. And even if OG says it's coercive, I will say that might be necessary, especially in conflicts where people have killed your family, especially between nations where you have lost brothers and sisters to a war because they killed your fellow soldiers. And I think it is difficult, but all the more, a conflict that is fueled by further rage, by further blindness because of the anger that you feel, rather than one that starts to tilt towards forgiveness, I think then only further perpetuates these cycles of violence, these cycles of dangerous conflict. And I think it is forgiveness that allowed for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that existed in post-apartheid South Africa. It is forgiveness that allows people to vote, or rather push for post-war negotiation peace processes, even if they killed people who you know were serving your nation. Why is it the case? Number one, I will say obviously forgiveness is not immediate. It won't instantaneously repair a war-torn society, but it ensures that people can forgive in the long-term process of nation building, because a virtue is something that isn't just valued. It is trained, it is socialized upon every individual, which means that in schools, you begin to teach that the people of different cultures are not as evil and you should be willing to forgive them, which means in history books, you explain why people did bad actions before, not just that they are animalistic, dangerous, thuggish criminals at all points in time. So, I will agree. In an immediately post-war society, for example, where there's a lot of tension, they won't just love each other and sing kumbaya. But over time, intergenerationally, a lot of this hatred begins to fade because you do not have the social conditioning to hate other individuals because of past and historical atrocity and crime, and therefore create for a broader, more peaceful society. But moreover, in a more nuanced discussion of minority groups, I would say most moral systems are constructed in ways that are able to, privilege the powerful. I think uniquely what forgiveness does, and I want you to look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I want you to look at Christian doctrine, the capacity to forgive individuals. The basic for a fundamental human dignity is to believe that people have an innate goodness, a capacity to change and do good, even if they were sinners before and did bad actions. That I think is the only thing that can convince a lot of cultures who are so fundamentally different, a lot of big groups to oppress small groups, to be able to ensure that they can take part in the reintegrative moral process of being able to put them back into society, being able to work with them, being able to ensure they can be part of the same schools, same neighborhoods, further on and so forth. I don't think that is possible for minority groups when they are seen as scum, when they are seen as born sinners, when they are seen as dangerous actors who have no capacity for future reform. And I think they take that so personally that even if it is coercive, it is necessary. OG.
If it is the case that you cannot call out someone who is powerful, in your world, the same individuals are people who will be expected to be forgiven. So the reparations are non-existent or completely marginal. In the comparison, you are not at least blamed for being a victim on our side.
Okay, so I think powerful people actually have very, very little, or rather, a lot of leverage with respect to you just randomly calling them out, because they can deny allegations, they can tilt the system of justice against you, versus being able to cooperate and work with them and ensuring that things like cancel culture don't actually work for a lot of celebrities and only force them to double down on their actions. Human agency then. One, a lot of our actions are socially influenced. If you are poor and you steal, if you are able to do things because you were born into a generation that told you to hate a certain group of individuals, I would say forgiveness is necessary to be able to ensure that people are able to move past their past influences and actions. And tangibly, that looks like being able to provide work for ex-convicts. I think OO says that it's important to have rehabilitation, but doesn't explain why that's a morally preferable action. I think we do that at CO. But I think moreover, it is the capacity to do things like notice the temporal nature of humanity. That you at 15 years old is very different from you at 25 years old. And it's necessary to be able to ensure that your past actions do not tie you down, that you have the capacity to move on from that. And it is only forgiveness that allows people to move beyond past mistakes that they have been able to make and ensure that people can engage in the actual process of beginning to change their actions, changing their belief systems. That's the only way you get old boomers to become more progressive. That's the only way you can get former Trump supporters to be able to support the other side. I don't think a system of hatred and vilification is able to do that. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and welcome the government whip.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yep.
Good. All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Look, I'm going to be completely honest. I honestly get really agitated when I hear teams completely saying that just one simple thing was having so much effect and it was so beneficial and I have the largest impact in the debate and I just want the debate from closing up. Look, I think the issue that both oppositions have with the lack of mechanism, they use the word virtue and generally forgiveness and then applies to everything, and literally everything was influenced by it, which I think is two problems. Firstly, it's obviously never proven, but secondly, if it was so strong of a narrative that it actually influenced the UN Declaration of Rights, I think that they concede to both governments that this might actually be a really coercive narrative to begin with, right? So I think already there it's probably quite a silly strategy to go with. But let's first discuss what this debate is not about, and this refers to both oppositions, because I think there were quite assertions made here that I find to be really unrealistic. Firstly, it's not about rich people who can only care about virtues exclusively because they're not fighting for survival. Please note, virtues affect literally everyone who is interconnected with other people in the society. Why? Because we communicate through expectations, right? The way that we act, how our behavior is shaped, and different people that we interact with is based on expectations. If something is a virtue and it's expected of me to be a certain way, it doesn't matter if I'm communicating to my mother, to my friend, or to my lover, or to my coworker. It affects everyone, no matter if I work 10, like if I earn 10 grand or 5. Secondly, terrible acts in which you need catharsis. I think this is a wash on both sides of the house, right? You probably wouldn't realistically forgive anyone on both sides of the house. You would probably feel angry against some sort of catharsis. It was just really like some hardly traumatic events. But this becomes important when we're talking about the reparations, like, or social movement for minorities that always talking about. Firstly, honestly, do you think that Black people care about forgiving white people from what they did in the past, right? Especially under the narrative, like, oh, it's nice to forgive, don't be an ass, which is just a very nice narrative oppositions want to stand behind, right? Which means, I think that when emotions and past trauma, past generations is so strong, it really doesn't change anything, right? You won't forgive for catharsis to past slave owners or Donald Trump, right? Or like the people that have been oppressing you for years. So like, oh, now we have to forgive, now I have to be bigger people. No one has used that narrative ever, and you will probably never forgive for completely and just find some sort of, I don't know, catharsis through forgiving Donald Trump for being an asshole. Like, what the fuck, honestly? And then conflicts that are like going from DLO to closing up. Like, I think, okay, you lost people in war. They were taken away from you. You had to be a refugee, right? Comfort women from Korea who were raped by Japanese soldiers. Still to this day, like, these leaders are 100 years old. They're making documentaries, like the one that they're still left standing because they did not forgive, no matter how much they apologized, right? Or they try to claim post-genocide reconciliation, UN Declaration of Rights. This is what Tim tells you. Those were diplomatic global changes. The reason that they happened because they were beneficial to a lot of countries, because people wanted trading, because I don't think wars are usually beneficial. It has literally nothing to do with the virtue of forgiveness, right? I think all of that is out of this debate. What is then the most crucial thing here? We are talking about average people who go through fights with friends, some petty actions were made to them, cheating, whatever. What the most crucial thing is for these people, and why we think that we prove to the most important thing in this debate, is therefore not only to make a choice as to how you're going to react, since there is no like shift pushing you to do one thing, obviously, but to probably talk about what happened, to get advice from people that care about, so you can rant, so you could just let it go, or shape like some sort of a different mindset and actually get some feedback from other people. The reason why I find communication to be the biggest impact of this debate and the people around us is because they shape everything that we have, right? Our friends make they can, or how they treat us or our family can literally make our day the best one or the worst one, right? The reason how they, the things they tell us, like we might get that advice, we might do something that is going to affect us in the end, right? The people around us obviously have such a huge effect, right? When it's a virtue, forgiveness is a virtue, you will not feel comfortable to share that, hey, I actually might still be hurt because my partner cheated on me, or like not want to be a bigger person, right? Because I am angry. right? Because you're generally less likely to fess up to other like intuition pub to other things that we find to be a virtue, right? That I was actually selfish and I prioritized myself, or I made some sort of scheme that benefits me and my family. Or we're generally less likely to fess up to lying, or like because we don't expect the people to understand, right? Because people are going to think that we're assholes, they're going to lose trust in us, or in this situation, they're going to think that we're petty, that we just cannot let it go, right? The feeling that this creates is sort of this self-doubt, right? Because for you to actually engage with all this, to gain any of the benefits that OG also wants to claim, is that you probably need to confront them, right? But this first, starts with introspection. It starts with talking to other people, right? When you think that it's fine to not like to still be bitter, and they're probably less likely to support you on opposition side, because they're probably just going to be like, oh, let it go, man. Can we please just stop talking about it? The person apologize. Can't you see that they're really sorry? Just let it go, right? And I think at that point, you don't actually let all these things go. And that's what makes you actually feel like shit and never confront them and have worse relationships that, also cares about so much, right? So I think on balance, right? On OG, when they are talking about agency and some power balance, I think it's cool, but I think it's a like sort of principled feeling that very often people don't quite is tangible or can relate to, right? But even if they want to talk about how people feel powerful or how they feel empowered or self-introspection or whatever, for all that to actually happen, you first need to feel like you can come out to other people about it and gain some support, not only to confront these feelings within you, but with other people, right? What I think does here to take a strategy that is washing out, right? And say mitigation is status quo isn't bad. When they say people are still going to be upset, this direct repercussions with our extension. Yes, but the question is how you're going to communicate it once you were hurt, right? And I think that generally, when they're talking about how they're going to be in a balance, and their only harm, literally always only harm is, as far as I can read out, possibly worse relationships, I guess. Honestly, for shitty relationships or fake friends, to keep peace or save face and not argue at parties, I don't give a shit. Not sure what the benefit of keeping this fake harmony is, but if you care about people, you will still move on through time. If these partnerships are crucial to you, other people are going to support you as well, right? If your partner cheated on you and you break up but remain friends, once bad emotions fade away with time, you remember the good time and nice memories, which deals with they will feel shit regardless narrative and mitigation. That was actually probably the only one still left. And at the end of the day, I think we proved to you the only most crucial mechanism as to how people actually interact with themselves and the surroundings around them when something is actually a virtue and a comparative or not. I think both sides took a real unrealistic burden, and what the mitigations just don't care about the benefits, proud to stand and call the government.
I thank the government whip and welcome the opposition whip to conclude the debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. You have the timer. I'll do three things in my speech. The first is to bring back the extension that had very little response to from the previous speaker and explain why that wins the entire debate together. But secondly, I'll destroy the OG case and I'll destroy the CG case. Firstly, we pointed out that this debate is the most relevant in situations where there's massive conflict, where there are people who are killed in times of war, in times of injustice, in times of post-authoritarian regimes, in times of instances where there are massive injustices in the world today. This is because it is in these places that it is not rational to forgive. And if you rely on the mechanisms coming from opening government, where they make a cost-benefit analysis of whether or not we should forgive a person when they killed your family, when they destroyed your home, when they ravaged your whole life, or from closing government where you say that people will naturally adhere to it in the end, these things will not happen because of the gravity of the actions that take place. And the violence is just too great that no one naturally will be able to conceptualize a world where they forgive their oppressor, where they forgive the person there. That's why the narrative is important. That's why the virtue is important. Because absent this, the natural state of man will not forgive in these circumstances. And note that this is important because we explained all the massive ramifications of this not happening. We explained how this leads to a cycle of violence, where when the previous oppressed individuals realize that they're the ones now in power, they're likely to be the oppressors. When the previous leaders of a post-colonial regime now become the corrupt leaders and starve people because of famine and declare conflict. This is a massive harm. And I want to wait now to what government bench argued. At best, what government says that on a micro level, the victims of an initial atrocity would not be able to be given the proper justice. They forgive unjustly when even if the forgiveness is not deserved. I agree that this may at worst case cause some harm to the victims if you believe their analysis. But note, this is nothing compared to creating a new generation of victims, a new cycle of millions of people being killed, a new cycle of millions of people being harmed. That is what we had to engage with, which they barely did. Their only response was, if the atrocity is so big, the forgiveness will not work on either side. There are a couple of responses to this. I would suggest that post-apartheid South Africa had the had the black South Africans significantly harmed under their side, probably had massive injustice against them, but it is still possible because of the narrative of things like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that people are made to forgive. So this is a pure assertion that they will not forgive without this narrative, or sorry, with this narrative, we explain that it's possible for them to do so. But secondly, even if they don't totally forgive, the importance of this narrative is that at the very least, it pushes people somewhat closer to the medium. That is to say, even if you don't fully forgive a person, the fact that you're less likely to be act irrationally, less likely to be so angry at them, and do things like having the Treaty of Versailles, which is incredibly oppressive, we would suggest that that is significantly important already in reducing the conflict, and has proven to you as more important than any other outcome we had in today's debate. Now let's take up the opening case. Their first claim is that you're not able to process your emotions properly because you'll be rushing to the process of forgiveness. We explain that this is linked to rushing the process and not necessarily the process of forgiveness in general. But secondly, we would suggest that the other potential outcomes, either A, denial that something actually happened, or B, anger at a particular person, are also less likely for you to process the information. For the reason that if you're angry, you have to justify your anger and therefore try to weed out behavior that might not be congruent to that belief. Or if you're denial, obviously you're not representing the particular thing that happened in the past. In fact, it is forgiveness, which requires, by definition, you recognizing what happened. You as an individual, even if the person does not apologize, knowing and processing what happened before you can forgive. You can't forgive something you do not know what happened or who perpetrated the particular action. That forces you, that makes you understand what happened, and therefore gets you better able to process your emotions. Then they say, well, we'll end up to trivialize the suffering of people. Note that this happens not on our side. And the reason for that is the glorification of being a forgiving person is rooted in how difficult something was to forgive in the first place. The gravity of the crime is how you built up the glorification. What makes one person more virtuous than another is the fact that they're a greater victim of a particular crime and that they were still able to forgive. That is why it's far more likely to recognize the gravity of the actions, because that's what the glorification does in comparison to your side of the house where they don't. The last claim they then make is that minorities are more likely to be oppressed by this. And I think this is where you have a deadlock in the opening exchange, right? Because OG says the poor and vulnerable are more likely to rely on virtues because they can't make money, while OO says that the people are more likely to rely on money because they need it in comparison to virtues where they don't have the time to process it. What we said in comparison is that no matter whether or not the poor are likely to be the perpetrators or not, the fact that you as an individual have the capacity to forgive is likely to be a cathartic experience independent of whether or not change is actually going to happen. We suggested that whether or not you forgive implies that because on both sides of the house, as a minority, you're still unlikely to get change anyway. Even if you're an African-American in the United States calling out police brutality, it's unlikely that you calling out will lead to any particular or tangible change. The most that you can get is some degree of solace, some degree of utility, some degree of meaning that only you get under our side of the house that you do not get under their side of the house. So we take out OG already. CG then. The first thing they try to say is somewhat contradictory to the opening when they say there's no need for this narrative because people will naturally gravitate to forgiveness already. So they say it's painful to hold into anchor, it's an obsession, it's incredibly problematic. Before I move on, CG.
Okay, so things like empathy, the natural desire not to die, political reasons, economics, I could go on but have 15 seconds, seem to be at least equally as good competing explanations for stuff like fucking post-genocide reconciliation. Huge impact, need huge mechanisms. Have them, please.
Okay, so all of these mechanisms rely on a rational framework of a human person. That is to say, people are acting rationally, calculating the cost benefits of their actions. That is not true for a person whose family died of war. It's not true for a person whose family was ransacked, and therefore do not operate in these calculative mechanisms. The most intuitive emotion is anger. The most intuitive action is revenge, and that's why a vast majority of conflicts. I'll just prove it to you by all the other examples. Look at the world wars, for instance, where a lot of the hateful dictators don't just rise into power for no reason, but rather rise into the power as justifying it by anger to another person. For Hitler, it was the Jews. For Bolsonaro, it was against the gay people or the people in Brazil who are likely to be immoral or conceived to be immoral. All of these things are rooted in anger, and that's why you cannot just wash this argument by saying other factors. We explain concretely why it happens, and therefore you don't engage. So then they say there's no need for the narrative because people naturally do it. the best version of this argument is that in the long run, people will forgive. But to the degree they themselves see it in the short run, they feel the pressure of anger, they feel the pain of obsession, in which case it's unclear why you want people to go through that experience versus just allowing them to shortcut it and feel the need for virtue in the very first place. The last game they say is that we should let people decide for themselves. Our response to this is that if you let people decide for themselves, it is unclear whether or not people are actually going to be are fair and rational on their side. We explain all the other counter pressures and inherent counter pressures via evolution. That means that no matter the circumstance of the individual, you're far more likely not to be rational. But lastly, we prove why morality and forgiveness itself is inherently moral, it's inherently just, because it recognizes the lacks of human agency, which even if we believe that they don't do this, they are rational on their side, it's good that we have a default option of forgiveness. All these reasons then show why CO provides the most substantial material, and that's why you ought to take this debate. Thank you.
Thank the opposition whip and everyone for the debate. As we've got a panel, we'll need to have a chat. So if you guys can drop out of this room and we'll call you back into the breakout room when we're ready.
Thank you, everyone.